I'm taking roll as we go. And I hope you guys all had a really good weekend. I hope you were able to connect with some family. Um, it was a good time. It was nice to have some time off. I have a lot of veteran friends as being taking roll as we go, an Army veteran. So I was able to connect with a few of those over the weekend. And, you know, it's nice just to see how people are doing and think about what's, I guess, the price that's been paid for what we have in our country. And to me, that's what Memorial Day is about. Yeah, I guess that's good enough. Well, welcome back. Happy Monday-ish. It is Tuesday. It is June 1st. Go ahead and put your phones away. They don't need to be out. Two people in the back. We have how many days of school left?
I think
you never count today because you're in it. So I believe we have 13 days left. Holy crud of actual school. Yeah, it's like 3 weeks and then we're done. So we've got a finals week in there and we've got a couple weeks to go over things. So I'm not sure. My goal is to get to 1980 and we'll see how well we can do covering the next 20 years in the next couple of weeks. If we can have some conversations about modern U.S. history, that'd be great. But I have a feeling we may not make it as much as, you know, because I want to give it credit for what it's due. All right, so let's just chit chat. I'm sharing my screen. I'm adding a few more people. We're starting to record right now. This is our civil rights unit. So in our civil rights unit, we're covering basically 1960 to 1980. And we've covered some of this stuff with the Cold War. So some of these terms and some of these concepts are going to be familiar to you, and some will be new. So as we go through this, I want to cover some of the resources that you have. We have our textbook, all of our chapters. That's normal. You got your tribes, and there's our class recordings. That's helpful to you if you miss a class or whatever. You need to go over something again. Now, I do have the study guide right here. That's for this unit. That's pretty heavy study guide, and I want to talk about that for just 1 second. This particular study guide is more focusing, I'm dragging it over right now. Again, this is a heavy duty dose of vocab, but that's exactly what I wanted to use this for. I'm going to give you until June 7th to complete this. Okay, just doing vocabulary. That's 4 sections or 4 chapters out of the book, but some of them are pretty short. But I want you to be able to have a fairly healthy vocab sheet. You can use Quizlet, you can use 3x5 cards, you can use whatever you like. But as we get into this, these are significant key terms or Supreme Court cases that we're going to talk about that actually still affect us today. One of these cases, we're going to look at Brown v. Board of Education, and that's trying to make sure that all things are equal for people in schools. Separate but not equal, or separate but equal is not really a thing that happened. They tried it, it didn't work. The black schools did not receive the same education as the white schools during segregation. So that was one of the things that was overturned. Another one that's important that I want you to know about is Miranda. There is a thing called Miranda. Have you guys ever heard of this relating to police? Does anybody watch any police shows or anything like that? Miranda, I believe is, I thought it was, there it is. So it's under the Great Society, Miranda v. Arizona. Does anybody know what Miranda is? The police have to say it. Yeah. And what are your rights? So Alejandro says, it's what the cops have to say. They have to read you your rights. Does anybody know what that is? I'll get you started.
I know a few.
Okay, so let me get you started and you'll see if you can add something in. You have the right to remain silent. Okay, hold it right there. Anything you say will be held or can be used against you in a court of law. So you're apprising a person that's being arrested or detained. They have the right to shut up. Because what happens if you speak?
They might shoot you.
Oh, no, they're not going to shoot you. They can use that information against you in a court of law. This falls under your Fifth Amendment. And I'm pointing to this right here. I don't know if you guys can see this. That is the Fifth Amendment. You have the right to not self-incriminate. So you don't have to bear testimony against yourself. Well, that's kind of an important thing. So as we go through some of these things, some will just touch upon them. Some, like MLK, we'll spend some time on and looking at freedom riders and looking at SNCC and looking at Malcolm X. So we're going to get into our civil rights movement, but I need you to have usable definitions, preferably from the textbook, preferably from these resources, because if you just go out and Google it, it may or may not be in the same context that we're using it. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So I'm giving you all of these resources to use. Here's the KBAT, the study guide, and then the crash course we're going to watch today. And then I'm going to give you some time to start the reading and start the vocab. So we will have some class time. I'm not going to do any heavy duty lecturing today. We're just going to be talking about these things. Okay. Cheyenne, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you at no cost. Well done, sir. Was that a lookup or is that knowledge in your head from movies? Cheyenne, you there? Okay, that's good. That's really good. Yeah, the only thing that you missed was that it would be provided to you at no cost. If you can't afford one, you will be given an attorney, so you have representation. Well played. Hopefully you never actually have to hear those words directly, but you never know. Okay. All right. So the resources we have are the civil rights. That's our student text. That's right here, which is our Freedom Now, the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi. That's our choices reading. I'm giving you 2 days to work on sections 1. So that part you are reading. That part we are going to spend a little time diving in. The textbook, you're only using it as a resource for us to kind of poke around, get some definitions and maybe look up some stuff, but definitely skim and scan it as you're looking at it. Look at the pictures, read the captions, but I'm not requiring you to read all 4 sections or all 4 chapters of the textbook. And then your last other little bit of homework is you've got your study guide. So that's going to have, you have Tuesday and Wednesday to work on that. And it's due the 3rd, which is Thursday. So hopefully that all makes sense. Now, one of the things I wanted to cover, and I didn't get a chance to do this on Friday because it was our test day, is the terms that I'm going to read off the terms. Actually, would you guys help me read off the terms? Each of you, I'm going to start here, go back, and then come forward. We just want to read the terms on the board, but it needs to be loud enough so they can hear it. Any term up there? Yeah. So we've got MLK is one of the terms, and I need to preface this again. At the end of the test, I had everybody do a little research and then find a term that or something that's interesting to you that you'd like to know more about. And then we put them on the board. So this is 2 classes. Not everybody did it. And so I know we've got MLK up there. So what's another term? Freedom Riders is another good one. Alejandro. Malcolm X. That's okay. The March on Selma. Okay. Black Panthers. Bloody Sunday is a thing. It was a very bad day for protesting. What's another one that's out there that we didn't call? Robert Kennedy. Okay, so we got John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, But we won't get into Ted Kennedy too much. Alejandro, is there anything else out there we missed? Okay, women's rights, women's liberation, we call it. So women's lib movement. The Million Man March. This was one of the first marches. Now, it didn't have 1 million men in it, but it was a black march on Washington, D.C. that was a political statement, and it was very powerful. It was a very pronounced, positive thing that showed unification of 1 million black men. But we'll get more into that. Birmingham, there was a protest in Birmingham in which Martin Luther King went to, and he wrote a letter that we're going to look at, a letter from a Birmingham jail. It's probably one of the things I think is some of his best writing. Any more? The Little Rock Nine. This was the first integrated school. Imagine 9 young children, high schoolers, showing up to an all-white school. They called the National Guard to keep the peace. Faculty members were protesting. The principal said no. The governor said yes. And then the National Guard was called in. It's a pretty rough time. It was a pretty crazy time. So these are some of the terms. Are there any other terms as you've thought about of the civil rights movement that we want to talk about? We'll look at Native American rights. We're going to look at some Latino rights with Cesar Chavez. We're going to look at women's rights. We'll start to see the beginnings of some LGBTQ movements gaining some popularity. Okay, Cheyenne. Who's Fred Hampton? I don't know that name, or that name escapes me at this moment. I just don't know. Okay, Freddie. Sorry, that makes sense. I know him by, so he was part of the leader of the Black Panthers. So we'll put his name up there with Black Panthers. Anything else? As we go through this civil rights unit, we're going to be looking at some Supreme Court cases. So you will be doing a little bit of research on some legal cases that went to the Supreme Court and how they affect us now and how they affect us in the future. Okay, we have a fire drill in 15 minutes. So right now I'm going to show you crash course because I want everybody to see it. And then once we're done with crash course, we're going to jump into, you can work on your vocabulary, or you can work on the Freedom Riders or the Freedom Now, the civil rights movement in Mississippi. We're reading the first 15 pages and completing the study guide, but that's due by the 3rd. Okay, you've got time for that. Today's the 1st, tomorrow's the 2nd, Thursday's the 3rd. So today's the 1st. Yeah, today's June 1st. So, all right. So yes, we do have a fire alarm at 9 o'clock, which I will be leaving. And I've got to go get my, oh dang, it was locked. That's why I wasn't there. Okay. All right. So let me show this with everybody. And if you got your camera on or whatnot in here, maybe just close your Chromebook now so it's not going to pick up any reverb. And I will just hit play.
Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to watch it too.
Please. We're going to show it as a class.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash. Today we're going to look at one of the most important periods of American social history, the 1950s. Why is it so important? Well, first, because it saw the advent of the greatest invention in human history. Television.
Mr. Green, I like TV. By the way, you're from the future. How does the X-Files end? Are there aliens or no aliens?
No spoilers, me from the past. You're gonna have to go to college and watch the X-Files get terrible just like I did. No, it's mostly important because of the civil rights movement. We're gonna talk about some of the heroic figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but much of the real story is about the thousands of people you've never heard of who fought to make America more inclusive. But before we look at the various changes that the civil rights movement was pushing for, we should spend a little time looking at the society that they were trying to change. The 1950s has been called a period of consensus, and I suppose it was, at least for the white males who wrote about it and who all agreed that the 1950s were fantastic for white males. Consensus culture was caused first by the Cold War. People were hesitant to criticize the United States for fear of being branded a communist. And second, by affluence. Increasing prosperity meant that more people didn't have as much to be critical of. And this widespread affluence was something new in the United States. Between 1946 and 1960, Americans experienced a period of economic expansion that saw standards of living rise and gross national product more than double. And unlike many previous American economic expansions, much of the growing prosperity in the 50s was shared by ordinary working people who saw their wages rise. To quote our old friend Eric Foner, by 1960, an estimated 60% of Americans enjoyed what the government defined as a middle-class standard of living. And this meant that an increasing number of Americans had access to things like television and air conditioning and dishwashers and air travel. That doesn't really seem like a bonus. Anyway, despite the fact that they were being stuffed into tiny metal cylinders and hurtled through the air, most Americans were happy because they had, like, indoor plumbing and electricity. The 1950s was the era of suburbanization. The number of homes in the United States doubled during the decade, which had the pleasant side effect of creating lots of construction jobs. The classic example of suburbanization was Levittown in New York, where 10,000 almost identical homes were built and became home to 40,000 people almost overnight. And living further from the city meant that more Americans needed cars, which was good news for Detroit, where cars were being churned out with the expectation that Americans would replace them every 2 years. By 1960, 80% of Americans owned at least one car, and 14% had two or more. And car culture changed the way that Americans lived and shopped. I mean, it gave us shopping malls and drive-through restaurants and the backseat makeout session. I mean, high school me didn't get the backseat makeout session, but other people did. I did get the Burger King drive-through, though. And lots of it. Our whole picture of the American standard of living, with its abundance of consumer goods and plentiful services, was established in the 1950s. And so for many people, this era was something of a golden age, especially when we look back on it today with nostalgia, but there were critics, even at the time. So when we say the 1950s were an era of consensus, one of the things we're saying is that there wasn't much room for debate about what it meant to be an American. Most people—
Can everybody hear that at home? My homies, can you hear that okay?
I can.
Perfect, thank you.
I can hear it too.
People agreed on the American values: individualism, respect for private property, and belief in equal opportunity. The key problem was that we believed in equal opportunity but didn't actually provide it. But some people were concerned that the cookie-cutter vision of the good life and this celebration of the middle-class lifestyle was displacing other conceptions of citizenship. Like the sociologist C. Wright Mills described a combination of military, corporate, and political leaders as a power elite whose control over government and the economy was such as to make democracy an afterthought. In The Lonely Crowd, sociologist David Reisman criticized Americans for being conformist and lacking the rich inner life necessary to be truly independent. And John Kenneth Galbraith questioned an affluent society that would pay for new cars and new missiles, but not for new schools. And we can't mention the 1950s without discussing teenagers, since this was the decade that gave us rock and roll and rock stars like Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and Elvis Presley and his hips. So you might have noticed something about all those critics of the 1950s that I just mentioned. They were all white dudes. Now, we're going to be talking about women in the 1950s and 1960s next week because their liberation movement began a bit later. But what most people call the civil rights movement really did begin in the 50s. While the 1950s were something of a golden age for many blue and white collar workers, it was hardly a period of expanding opportunities for African Americans. Rigid segregation was the rule throughout the country, especially in housing, but also in jobs and in employment. In the South, public accommodations were segregated by law, while in the North, it was usually happening by custom or de facto segregation. To give just one example, the new suburban neighborhoods that sprang up in the 1950s were almost completely white, and this remained true for decades. According to Eric Foner, as late as the 1990s, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations less than 1%. And it wasn't just housing. In the 1950s, half of black families lived in poverty. When they were able to get union jobs, black workers had less seniority than their white counterparts, so their employment was less stable. And their educational opportunities were severely limited by substandard segregated schools. Now, you might think the civil rights movement began with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, or else Brown versus Board of Education, but it really started during World War II, with efforts like those of A. Philip Randolph and the soldiers taking part in the Double V Crusade. But even before that, black Americans had been fighting for civil rights. It's just that in the 1950s, they started to win. So desegregating schools was a key goal of the civil rights movement, and it started in California in 1946. In the case of Mendez versus Westminster, the California Supreme Court ruled that Orange County, of all places, had to desegregate their schools. They'd been discriminating against Latinos. And then California's governor, Earl Warren, signed an order that repealed all school segregation in the state. That same Earl Warren, by the way, was Chief Justice when the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education came before the Supreme Court in 1954. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, had been pursuing a legal strategy of trying to make states live up to the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson that required all public facilities to be separate but equal. They started by bringing lawsuits against professional schools, like law schools, because it was really obvious that the 3 classrooms and no library that Texas set up for its African-American law students were not equal to the actual University of Texas's law school. But the Brown case was about public schools for children. It was actually a combination of 5 cases from 4 states, of which Brown happened to be alphabetically the first. The Board of Education in question, incidentally, was in Topeka, Kansas, not one of the states of the old Confederacy, but nonetheless a city that did restrict its schooling by race. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Stan, the last 2 weeks you have given me 2 extraordinary gifts, and I am thankful. It is Earl Warren from Brown versus Board of Education. Huzzah! Justice Warren is actually quoting from sociological research there that shows that segregation itself is psychologically damaging to black children because they recognize that being separated out is a badge of inferiority. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Brown decision was a watershed, but it didn't lead to massive, immediate desegregation of the nation's public schools. In fact, it spawned what came to be known as massive resistance in the South. The resistance got so massive, in fact, that a number of counties, rather than integrate their schools, closed them. Prince Edward County in Virginia, for instance, closed its schools in 1959 and didn't reopen them again until 1964. Except they didn't really close them because many states appropriated funds to pay for white students to attend, quote, private academies. Some states got so into the resistance that they began to fly the Confederate battle flag over their state capitol buildings. Yes, I'm looking at you, Alabama and South Carolina. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and got arrested, kicking off the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted almost a year. A lot of people think that Rosa Parks was simply an average African-American working woman who was tired and fed up with segregation, but the truth is more complicated. Parks had been active in politics since the 1930s and had protested the notorious Scottsboro Boys case. She'd served as secretary for the NAACP, and she had begun her quest to register to vote in Alabama in 1943. She failed a literacy test 3 times before becoming one of the very few black people registered to vote in the state. And in 1954, she attended a training session for political activists and met other civil rights radicals. So Rosa Parks was an active participant in the fight for black civil rights long before she sat on that bus. The bus boycott also thrust into prominence a young pastor from Atlanta, the 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. He helped to organize the boycott from his Baptist church, which reminds us that black churches played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. That boycott would go on to last for 381 days, and in the end, the city of Montgomery relented. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that was, of course, only the beginning for Martin Luther King, who achieved his greatest triumphs in the 1960s. After Montgomery, he was instrumental in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black civil rights and church leaders who pushed for integration, and they needed to fight hard, especially in the face of massive resistance and an Eisenhower administration that was lukewarm at best about civil rights. But I suppose Eisenhower did stick up for civil rights when forced to, as when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to prevent the integration of Little Rock Central High School by 9 black students in 1957. Eisenhower was like, you know, as the guy who invaded Normandy, I don't think that's the best use for the National Guard. So Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division, not the entirety of it, but some of it, to Little Rock, Arkansas to walk kids to school, which they did for a year. After that, Faubus closed the schools, but at least the federal government showed that it wouldn't allow states to ignore court orders about the Constitution. In your face, John C. Calhoun. Despite the court decision and the dispatching of federal troops, by the end of the 1950s, fewer than 2% of black students attended integrated schools in the South. So the modern movement for civil rights had begun, but it was clear that there was still a lot of work to do. But the emergence of the civil rights movement shows us that the picture of consensus in the 1950s is not quite as clear-cut as its proponents would have us believe. Yes, there was widespread affluence, particularly among white people, and criticism of the government and America generally was stifled by the fear of appearing to sympathize with communism. But there was also widespread systemic inequality and poverty in the decade that shows just how far away we were from living the ideal of equal opportunity. That we have made real progress, and we have, is a credit to the voices of protest. Next week, we'll see how women, Latinos, and gay people added their voices to the protests and look at what they were and were not able to change in the 1960s. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then. Crash Course is made with the help of all.
Okay. That gives us the basis for the beginning of the civil rights movement. But like I said, in the 50s, it was starting. And then we've got 20, 30 years of road to cover. So I think I said 60s. It's actually 50s, 60s, and 70s, up to 79, 1980s when we're going to go to.
Hey,
So we've got our fire drill in just a minute. And I'd like you guys to work on taking care of business. If you want to, I will leave the website up, the Zoom up. I'd like you guys to stay. We'll be back in like 10 or 15 minutes. So use this time, go get a breakfast or some cereal or something, and come back and get started on your reading or get started on your vocabulary. Mr. Orm,
Yes,
I sent you those
sir.
PDFs that you needed. And do you want a breakout room for you and Oscar? So you can work on the other email you sent me.
I have to go out with the fire drill as well.
Oh,
So,
you're here? Okay. So Oscar, you're on your own.
so you can start looking at the reading, okay?
Okay. I gotta get some breakfast in my system.
So take a few minutes, get breakfast. All right, everybody, we should be back in just a few minutes. So I'm going to mute this so you don't have to hear it. But I am going to stop recording. So at this point, please work on the reading for the choices reading. That's part 1. Or start on that vocabulary list, which is quite long, but I'm giving you a week to work on. All right. So I will stop sharing right now, and I will just kind of let it sit here. I expect you guys to be here. I got 26 in right now. There should be 26 when we come back from our fire drill. Aren't you lucky we're not doing a fire